When burnout forces you to rethink everything, the path forward can feel uncertain. But what if that turning point became the doorway to freedom financially, professionally, and personally? In this episode, we explore how walking away from one career can open the door to wealth, purpose, and a whole new way of living. Welcome to the U World Order Showcase podcast, where we feature life health transformational coaches and spiritual entrepreneurs who are stepping up to be the change they seek in the world. I'm your host, Jill Hart, the Coach's Alchemist, on a mission to help coaches and entrepreneurs amplify their voice, monetize their mission, and get visible. If you're ready to start attracting premium clients without chasing algorithms or hunting people down like a banshee on a mission, head on over to coachesalchemist.com and schedule your free client acquisition audit. It's the first step to building a business where your clients seek you out rather than you having to chase them down. Today, we are chatting with Philip Jayhawk Chan. Philip is the CEO and President of Lightspeed Investing, a private investment firm helping professionals build financial independence through futures and options trading. A former aspiring surgeon who left medicine due to burnout, Philip now leads a team of elite traders and mentors dedicated to precision, performance, and sustainable wealth building. He is passionate about empowering others to make their own path, teaching the principles of trading, and offering customized coaching that aligns with both ethics and long-term success. Welcome to the show, Philip. It's great to have you with us.
What's going on, Joe? Happy to be here as well.
It's been a minute. We've been planning this for, I think, about 6 weeks now.
Mm.
So I'm really glad that you were able to show up today and have this conversation about investing. So I'm going to ask you the big question, which is, what's the most significant thing in your opinion as individuals we can do to make an impact on how the world is going?
Wow, that's a profoundly deep question to open up the gate, but I'm happy for it. I would say the number one thing is to find your purpose first and foremost and operate in a way where you can show up every single day. As I tell my team as an executive, I work part-time, full-time, and overtime, but at the same time, I do not work at all because I love what we do, and more importantly, I love who I get to do it with.
Yes, I love that. And there is that old adage, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. And
That's right.
sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not true, but uh, you
hmm
know, if you're not doing something contributing to the world,
Yeah.
what's the point?
Well, th this is really the sign. It's doing something that every single day you're excited to go after, and then when you're done at the end of the day, you can't wait to get back to it. That's when you know you found it. And it can take forms and different avenues, but you got to find it, right? You do have to be able to pay the bills. So there's got to be, I would say, a hybrid between substance, depth, and your passion, right? And if you can find what is the best thing for you with your personality, with your strengths, and with your environment. I mean, it took me a little bit to get here, right? That's why I left medicine. It's definitely not the most easy thing to do, but if you persist strategically, you can find it and you will get there. And when you do, you
Yeah.
will not ever need a vacation like most nine to fivers because they need an escape. When you have the opportunity to vacate, you will deny it because you're already on vacation every day. And that's how I feel like I live my life now.
I feel that way too. It's like vacations are an interruption in a life that I'm enjoying. It's like,
Yes,
I don't
correct.
know why I need to
Yeah,
go on
we don't
vacation.
yeah, I'm already enjoying my life. Exactly.
I
So
heard
yeah, I
Alex
mean that
Ramosi
would be
talk
I mean
about that
that's
one
like
time that way.
that's like the fundamental, I would say, like meaning of life, right? Yeah. That's why I was so pleasantly surprised that we're going to open up with this question. It's amazing. That was the first time ever that someone hit me like that.
Okay, so I have to ask you another big question, and this
Yes.
is really I'm on like the edge of my seat to know the answer to this.
Okay. We've been waiting 6 weeks for this.
I have. So
Yeah.
Jayhawk Chan.
Yes,
How did
ma'am.
you get the
Yes.
Jayhawk in there?
Yeah, so I've been Jayhawk raised in Kansas ever since I was 9. I moved initially from Hong Kong, City of International Commerce, and when I first landed here in Kansas, I knew it was home. You know, when you have the experience of worldly travels, you really start to appreciate the little things. And for me, being a city boy that loves the suburbs, first and foremost, the fresh air and vast amount of space and land was really what caught my attention, right? Because in Hong Kong, you have so like millions of people crammed, right? It's like no different than New York or London. It's great for commerce, of course, but there's a lot of little things in life that you just don't get the same quality for, right? The quality of your water, the fact that Americans in the right areas can drink tap water, right? And also, have really clean, fresh air, and like I said, clean roads. I mean, it was just amazing for me. Now, on top of that, right, this was something that I did not know, but Kansas is a championship state in both football and basketball. And so when I was only 16, and when Mario Chalmers hit the game tying shot against Memphis to send us into overtime, which we ultimately beat John Calipari and Derrick Rose back in the '08 NCAA tournament. That's when I was officially indoctrinated as a Jayhawk, and I knew that Kansas and KU was the only school I needed to go to, right? When we won the championship, I was only 16. I was across that house right there in that basement with my best friends at the time. And when we had won the championship outright, we all ran around the neighborhood screaming with our shirts off, "We won the chip! We won the chip!" And like I said, that radically has changed and influenced my life to where yes, I was supposed to take over my dad's accounting firm in Hong Kong, but I said thanks, no thanks, because one, I'm a city boy that loves the suburbs. And two, I did not want to wake up and do people's taxes. So when he was like, "Okay, kiddo, what do you want to do?" I said, "I have no clue. Let me explore the medical field." And at the time, being a surgeon really resonated with me because of the hands-on aspects, the intellectually challenging aspects, and of course the lucrative career, right? And so as I got immersed deeply into the realm of surgery, right, I was headed towards becoming either plastics, orthopedic, or cardiothoracic surgeon. And what I learned was I only had interest, right? I didn't have the passion. And on top of that, basketball as a Jayhawk always had a way of pulling me in to where, it was really during my master's after I graduated college that the desire of owning an NBA team started becoming my calling. And I knew that, okay, if that is going to be my personal goals and dreams that I want to pursue, something's got to change. Because in today's markets, you need at least $5 to $10 billion, right, to be an NBA team owner. And no matter how lucrative a surgeon's salary is, you're looking at plus minus $500,000 a year. That will never get it done, right? And at the end of the day, physicians are, no matter how you slice it, high paying employees, right? High salaried
Yeah.
employees. And it's hard to have autonomy and freedom. So there's, I would say, a huge amount of influence, a championship influence on me as a Jayhawk. Also, this is why I'm so passionate. A lot of people know this, but we coached Michael Jordan, right? Like we all are basketball. I mean, this is not from anywhere, but I am backed by the source, Joe. Because you have to understand, Dean Smith is who coached Michael Jordan at UNC, right? But Dean Smith himself was a Jayhawk champion back in the 1950s. And guess what? The UNC court is named after Dean Smith himself. Another blue-blooded school in Kentucky, there is the court out of Rupp Arena. And out of, he himself was a Jayhawk champion back in the 1920s, winning back-to-back championships in 1920 and 21. It was before the NCAA championships. So it was the National Helms Tournament, National Helms Championship. And the whole point is, if you like real estate, as a Jayhawk, we have territories in all three, Allen Fieldhouse, the UNC Dean Smith Center, as well as the Rupp Arena in Kentucky. Also coached Michael Jordan in basketball. So that is where the passion comes from. That is where it is my middle name. It will be government official here in the next year. And that's why I'm super passionate because it radically changed my entire life. Just as a side note, the whole NBA ownership thing is for me a last resort move because my whole thing was if I have to buy a team just to put myself on the roster of an NBA team, then that's how I'm going to get there. But in the meantime, what I would like to do is create a lot of wealth, use that wealth to get access to the top level NBA skills trainers, right? And see how far I can push my athletic ability. Because growing up, I always sacrificed basketball because of my career. I made the team in high school. 90 per, but I never had much support, and mentorship. 90% of what you see on the court is self-taught. So for me, it was just always that question mark of how great can I be? In business, they say you are who you hang around. You are the average of the five, right? If you hang around millionaires, multimillionaires, and billionaires, you will most likely be the next one. So I said, well, why don't I hang around NBA Hall of Famers, right? Because if I do my networking and relationship building the right way through business, then that will probably happen in basketball. And I'm so glad that since this summer, right, which was been 5 years in the making, I've been able to work out with Kyrie Irving's trainer,
Mhm.
where we did this intense weekly boot camp. It was like 6 to 8 hours a day, 30 hours total. And coming out of that, this summer, I was told that I do have what it takes to be a pro athlete. So, I was kind of a late bloomer. I really found my passion around basketball, in my mid to late 20s. Was always thinking about giving it up, but I had earned my way into a league of XD1 and overseas players when I was 26. I hit game winner when I was 27, and the whole time it was like it became right interest, passion, and then an obsession that I just could not look over. But Jill, for me, I'm not delusional, right? So I just knew that, at that point, for me to do anything with basketball, I would have to get it done through business. And so that is
Yeah.
where, everything that I do in business is geared towards basketball and the NBA. I want to get access to the highest level NBA skills trainers so that not only can I get exposure to that, but once I do, bring it all back to Kansas, my alma mater, and make it even more of a national powerhouse.
Yeah, I love that. I love your passion because you can hear it when you're talking. And I love how it's not just like we're going to talk about investing because that's what you do for your line of business, but it's all connected, and it's not just about the money, it's about this bigger vision that you have.
Yeah.
And I really think that people need to understand that money comes, but it comes as a result of something bigger than you. It's just like the universe realizes you need certain assets in order to be able to accomplish the dreams and passions that you have, that you are here to share with the world. And it's just like it's so amazing. I love
Thank you
that
so
about
much.
you.
Yeah. And it was definitely not easy. This has not happened overnight, right? I had to go
Yeah.
through so much internal struggles and tension, right? With, do I really want to leave medicine?
Mhm.
Losing girlfriends on this topic, and even family members, right? Because of the misalignment of what they thought I was going to be doing with all this time invested, having it, all of a sudden, be pulled out the rug and starting afresh, and going down this path, which I've never really talked about, right? So for all of the listeners listening in, just know that anything is possible in this life, but you do have to have strategic persistence. You got to go after mentorship. You got to invest in yourself, and you gotta have skill sets to go after where, when you are in that right room, you can negotiate because you have things that you can bring to the table.
Yeah. I my hat's off to you for recognizing that even though you were well into that path to become a surgeon, recognizing that, "No, this isn't me. This isn't where I feel like I'm supposed to be," and
Hmm.
and starting over. I mean,
Thank
it
you.
takes a lot to do that.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't, I would say, like a fresh start, like in a new
Yeah.
industry, right? Like I said, it was strategically done. So my master's under KU Med at the time was the only non-clinical masters that I could tie to business, right? It was
Mhm.
their applied statistics, data science, and analytics masters under KU Met's biostatistics degree. So I was like, okay, it was seriously just an excuse. It was a facade to let people know I was still busy, I was doing things, but really during that time period, I called it my own self-directed MBA, right? Where I really
Mhm.
wanted to reflect and explore options in that time. The concept of mentorship was really introduced to me in terms of how successful people got to success and accelerated their success. So one of the things that really hit me was not only would I ask and interview people, right, but I got this insight on people changing their careers, and I'm
Mm.
like, if I'm going to do something, I better do it now because I don't want to
Yeah.
be in med school and in residency. I left right before entering med school, right? Now, granted, I also have, social relationships in this realm. Like my sister is a child neurologist. I have a lot of friends in med school and residency or as practicing doctors. But on top of that, I read this book called On Living. Joe, which is essentially a compilation of people's deathbeds interviewed by a nurse, right? And after you read that, you're just like, yeah, there's no way I'm gonna have a life like any of these people. Because once you go through it, you're like, this is just pathetic. It's just so sad. Like you're what, 80, some 90 years old, and you want to like now talk about how you have regrets on things that you could have changed 30 years ago. It's like, what have you been
Yeah.
doing all this time, you know? But that's the mentorship, right? It doesn't have to always be direct, right? It could be indirect. So not only did I seek after like 20 mentors online, I also shrunk it down, to my top five after, several years during that duration of my master's, essentially. But more importantly, I also binge watched Shark Tank so I can hang out indirectly with Mark Cuban, right? Because he at the
Mhm.
time was a fellow NBA team owner as well, who made himself public. So that's how I could learn some acumen from him, right? As well. And I would say before I made the decision to not only forego my master's, I was 98% completed. It did not make sense to me that, I had to take a business analytics course and a comprehensive exam to finish my degree. So in my last semester, which is the summer of 2021, that's when I decided to take the leap of faith and I opened my own LLC and I never looked back, right? I did not graduate. But the idea here is, I didn't do it willy-nilly, right? Like I was working part-time, I was doing my master's part-time, but really full-time I was trying to explore and figure things out for myself, right? So even though all of that was an excuse, I didn't pull the trigger until my last semester, right? Which was basically like 3.5, almost 4 years in, right, in that journey. Before I, like I said, became a bona fide business owner in the summer of 2021. And then I had to, figure out my own thing for a good year and a half, 2 years before I stumbled upon this current opportunity. And at that time, right, when I ran into my current business partner now, I had already been a compilation of investments, right? Investing into myself, investing in my skill sets. So when I did meet my current business partner and I heard about what he did, right? Not only did we have great rapport, he was the last person that I met at a Grant Cardone event. We talked for about an hour and a half. We ended up walking out the event together. I decided to assess his investing methodology, right? Because he's a fellow hedge fund manager for a good full month. I met him at the end of November in 2022, Joe. And so it was before the turn of 2023 when I made the decision. And when I came out of that event, I had my own original plans, right, of things to execute and so forth. But I knew that it would make sense for me to become a client, to get mentored under him. But I did not know that, that would ultimately spring forward my career where I am now the president and CEO of this firm, right? Of this joint venture, so to speak. And that all happened because, I took the leap of faith in him, in myself. I learned how to make take a couple $100 to a couple $1,000 at the beginning. But more importantly, it was during those intimate client conversations that really allowed us to recognize, hey, there may be business potential here in terms of partnership. Let's give ourselves a test trial. In the first month, he delivered, I delivered, and after 3 bona fide months, the CEO conversation happened, right? So, and now I've been the CEO coming on 3 years. So it's definitely been a journey, but if you stick with it, you will find it.
And it's you allowed it to be a process, and you skipped right over the Grant Cardone part of it, but to me that's a signal that, hey, you recognized where the community that you wanted to be part of was hanging out. You got yourself there, you interacted, you made other connections, which is the whole thing about going places and being in community with people that
Yes.
are walking similar paths that you're walking. And a lot of those kinds of community events have a pretty steep price tag attached to them. It keeps out the
Hmm.
riffraff. So the people that you're
Yeah,
going to be
that's right.
interacting with, they're your
That's right.
peers, and
Hmm.
they're wanting to go forward. So when you make connections in those kinds of communities, you're
Right.
you're really catapulting yourself forward exponentially, and
Yeah.
that you were open to like starting out in a mentor-mentee relationship with this person instead of like,
Hmm.
I know it all and I'm just going to tell you what for.
That's
y-
right.
you were able to just like be willing to be tutored and and shown the ropes, and it's just
But
blossomed into this amazing business that you have now. I love this
yeah.
story. I love it
Thank you
so
so much. Thank
much.
you so much. And I would want people to recognize, like, before that happened, I was already doing that. Like, I was
Mhm.
doing that during my master's, but just at a smaller level. Like, I did that locally, right? In Overland Park, Kansas, here in this affluent suburban area. So I went after, like, that's where I honed my networking skills, right? I
Yep.
got invited into a private business club here, right? Before I had the wherewithal to travel to Florida but I
Mhm.
knew that my ability to transcend was when I finally got myself into rooms with high caliber business owners, right, in a high caliber
Mhm.
business environment. But you don't start there, right? You have to be able to be resourceful and master, right, even the beginning levels, and then the
Yeah.
more intermediate levels before you hit the advanced things, right? And Grant Cardone, I started small. I mean, I invested, at the beginning just in his audiobooks, his books,
Yep.
then a couple $100 programs. I mean, at this point, I probably invested over 500,000 in myself, right?
Yeah.
Amongst all the programs, but with Grant specifically, definitely over 100K easy, and just everything. But Grant was not the only one, right? Like I said, well, Grant really solidified it when I saw in 2020 during the pandemic that he became a bona fide billionaire through Undercover Billionaire on Discovery, right? That's why I was like, okay, out of all my 20 people, I need to really compress it to my top ones that are I would say the best and the ones that I could really resonate with. And they became Grant Cardone, um, John Maxwell, Brandon Dawson, of course, alongside Grant and Alex Ramosi. So I
Mhm.
just really stayed laser focused and I, listen to those people as much as I can. With an honorable mention of Mark Cuban.
Yeah. Can't leave him out.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Him and Tillman Fertitta, right, who is the owner of the Rockets.
So let's talk
Because
a little bit
Tillman
about
wrote this book called like "Shut Up and Listen," and that was one of the books
yeah.
that yeah, yeah. But you were saying,
I love how you put that right after that. Shut up and listen. So let's segue a little bit into what you actually do right now for other people and how you
hmm
help them. So you want to share how that all looks?
yeah, absolutely. So we do represent a group of medical professionals who are now investment professionals, and over the last 15 years, we've been able to run a make money firm quite successfully. What that means is we either make money for people or we teach people how to make money, specifically through the global financial markets. But this is not stocks or equities. This is futures, commodities, and stock options, whereas
Mhm.
these asset classes are known to be a bit more risky and volatile. And that's why most people shy away from them. But if you know what you're doing and if you have the right context, bona fide billionaires have come out of this space. So there's a gentleman by the name of John Arnold who took 1.5 million to 1.5 billion in 2.5 years, trading the commodity natural gas the right way. He's also a fellow Vanderbilt alum. And with what he accomplished, he was coined the youngest self-made billionaire in the US at age 33 back in '07. And my business partner, who's a former internal medicine physician, he actually had the opportunity to get trained by Arnold prior to him becoming a billionaire, right? But more importantly, if you did your due diligence and research, you will find that on Forbes, the world's top 42% are in the finance and investment space. So no one really talks about this space, right? There's other names outside of Arnold, like James Simmons, whose net worth is 30 billion. He did it in 15, 16 years. He was the pioneer in our field that figured out automated software trading, right? There's Ken Griffin of Citadel, of course, who manages, I think, 55 billion. Paul Hutchinson, 48 billion. I had the opportunity to actually speak at one of his events, and I was very grateful for that. But the idea here is in the hedge fund space, this is a very safeguarded conversation, right? Colleges do not teach you this. Your typical career fairs are not going to mention this. And so, unlike fellow fund managers who are just super obsessed about growing their fund and AUM numbers, we're a bit different because are here to democratize access to this space where people can learn a high income skill set, right, and be empowered on the topic of finance appropriately, right? So they actually know how to navigate these markets and convert them into your own ATM machine. One of the ways that we really separate ourselves, Joe, is that since talk is cheap, we actually go live, we prove what we teach, and we make the money in front of you. And our whole thing is if you do not see us make a minimum of 50K or more, you can feel free to never talk to us again. And that's in half an hour. And the reason why we're able to do that is because money at the end of the day is a simple byproduct of the right inputs, right? It's just an output. So if you have the ability to execute, right, with your proper decision making and at a 90% accuracy, I see this game like developing a skill set where you can do surgery not on a patient, but on these markets, right, with surgical precision. So similar to diagnosing X-rays, CT scans, and MRI scans, when you can diagnose these charts the right way, you can actually print money.
I love that. I think people don't realize that almost, I could probably say everyone who is anyone, including people like Elon Musk, the president, they all make their money in the markets. They have these big businesses, but the money is made in the markets. And it just like they they manipulate markets in some cases.
Well,
Like I've seen
yeah,
Elon
well,
Musk manipulate the crypto market 3 times.
sure, probably because of the size that he's putting on his in his positions, right? And that's one of the privileges that you get, right, when you achieve a certain level of success in
Mhm.
life. But more importantly, I think what you're saying is this is a great income source, right? That
Mhm.
is separate from business, right? Because you can make money without talking to people. You can make money without
Yeah.
having to, to rely on the people business that we're on. And that's why it's so exciting. We have been able to retire medical professionals from their careers if they want to, right? Because this game can be someone's supplemental income, full-time income, and full-blown career, depending on what they want to do with it. And we've been having crazy amounts of success recently, especially with the volatility that we're seeing, right? Like the Dow move that is moving a couple of thousand points. And that's because, in October is known as the hedge fund shorting month. So between October and March, there's known to be a lot of volatility. But what I'm also really proud of is as we have improved our teaching methodologies, we're also seeing a lot of case studies and clients, right, in the recent months as well. Our top ones is that the Dr. Joe who took 5K to right under 5 million in just 4 short months. I mean, that is absolutely unheard of. That is one of our best
It's
case studies
crazy.
to where he even, told his daughter after being 2 months in the program to quit her software engineering job to look at this game and do this full time, right? She's not obviously on his level, but we do have success where clients make anywhere between $500 to $2,000 a day, right? We have another gentleman who is making 5 to 6 figures every single day because of taking what we teach and applying it to what he's normally doing with stock options, right? So I think last Friday, exactly a week ago, he made 200K in the markets. This Wednesday, he made right under 200K again. And then, on multiple other occasions, he's made 30K, 52K, 42, and 125 as well.
So where are your clients, like what is the minimum that you would suggest people
And
have?
And that's so great. So how we get our clients profitable is making sure that we put them through 3 phases, first and foremost, right? Because I look at this game like surgery. So I think, Joe, we can all agree that there's a fundamental difference between learning surgery and actually operating live in a live patient, right? In a live OR room.
Right.
You don't just go learning and you go do it, right? So you want to first learn and absorb like a sponge. That's phase one. Phase two, you want to make sure you practice on a mannequin patient, right? Where you essentially focus on all the inputs correctly and execute correctly first, as we talked about, right? So you want to make sure you can recognize setups that are profitable so that you're not gambling. If you're taking a trade where you don't really know why, you don't have the right thesis and supporting arguments, you're probably going to end up losing money, right? Which is something that we do not teach you to do. So making sure that you can operate at least 80% accuracies or more before you ever transition to live and put real money on the line. And what you're asking is a great question because it helps provide debunking on a lot of myths and misconceptions. If you just Googled a really popular brokerage to invest in these markets, interactive brokerage will come up. right? And on that platform, alongside a lot of the other major platforms, you're looking at a five-figure barrier to entry, right? Because to trade one contract of the Dow, you're looking at 12,000. To trade one contract of gold and oil, respectively, it's about 17 and 24,000. But in what we recommend, right, which is a specialized brokerage, you can get it in for as low as 500, a grand, and $2,000. And if you don't even have the capacity for that, there's what we call the micro markets, where you can get in at 50, 100, and $200, right? So when you are ready to start in phase three, you can, start between 2 to 3 grand. Even if you have millions, I do not care. You want to do this prudently, right? You want to start small. You want to make sure you have the skill sets down, and then you want to take it to the moon. But the idea here is, Jill, right? It does not cost you a fortune, even though I am giving you, some of our amazing results, right, in the 5 and 6 figures range. Please don't take that erroneously and think that that is also what's required to make that money. In our space, this is what we call asymmetric risk to reward, right? So you get in for low risk but high returns and high yielding results. Again, if you know what you're doing, right? And that's the key.
And that's what you teach people, is how to get
Absolutely.
from here to the
Hmm.
moon in a responsible way.
Hmm.
And you do offer the service where you will do it for people, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So that is the main way that we make money, right? That's the money management. That's the hedge fund division where we do manage right around $500 million, right? But again, unlike fund managers who are super obsessed about growing their fund numbers and AUM numbers, we're more so passionate about democratizing access to this space. And the reason is because my business partner and I both did not find fulfillment within the medical field, right? As we go back to the story that I told you, and I was supposed to take over my dad's accounting firm before that. But I never saw a hedge fund manager on the internet, right? When I would research US news and reports for top jobs, right? Most satisfied careers, best paying jobs. I never saw it was just always CEO, right? If you saw the business side of things, but no one ever talked about being a fund manager. It was a financial advisor, right? Which was totally not true. If you look at financial advisors compared to, say, the fund space, right? It's a totally different ball game and totally different caliber of conversation. So again, right, there's a lot of things that they just don't teach you in the traditional social structures of schools, of communities, of normal conversations, and we're here to change that.
Yeah, I love it. There was a time in my life where I actually did work for a hedge fund. I was in their accounting
Oh,
department.
really?
My job was
Interesting.
to cost out at the end of the day what the fund was worth.
Mm.
Um, anyway, I love that you're doing this. And you you primarily hang around on LinkedIn? Is that
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
where
I
people
am
can
on
find you?
all the social media platforms, but LinkedIn is the one where you will find me most.
Awesome. And that's linkedin.com/, I think it's IN// Philip Jayhawk Chan, where
That's
you can
right.
find him there. And he also has a website, lightspeedinvesting.com, correct?
Hmm. And if you're a Spotify listener, feel free to reference our podcast there as well. We run a lot of free events, right? Feel free to check us out. One of the ways that we also really separate ourselves is that because talk is cheap, right? We teach at night and we show you the how, but in the mornings we do it live in front of you and we make the money in front of you. Again, our whole guarantee is if you do not see us make a minimum of 50K or more in that 30 minutes, you can feel free to never talk to us again. And no one's been able to call us on that in the last 15 years. As a matter of fact, this Tuesday morning, it was a really volatile day. We were able to make just right under 500,000, or 482K in front of our live audience. One of our biggest mornings ever.
Wow. It's really impressive.
Last time we did that on a Wednesday afternoon when the Federal reports came out. It was a 400K day. But like I said, the markets are really picking up. And as we've grown, our methodologies, our approach, we're always looking to refine it. So we're also growing as well.
That's great. That's great. I really appreciate you coming in and chatting with me today, Philip. This has been an amazing conversation.
Absolutely. I think it's important for more people to know how to, I would say, design their lives according to their purpose, right? And really go after the things that make sense for them, but also do it in a way where they can pay their bills. So you got to cover
Yeah.
the practical.
Yeah, for sure. To learn more about Philip and his investing coaching, please visit lightspeedinvesting.com or head on over to LinkedIn and um, search for his name, Philip Jayhawk Chan, and you will be sure to find him there. We'll be sure to put
That's right.
those links in the show notes too. Thanks for tuning in today to the U World Order Showcase podcast. If you're ready to amplify your voice, monetize your mission, and start attracting premium clients, your next step is simple. Head to thecoachesalchemist.com and schedule your free client acquisition audit. Be sure to join us for our next episode where we share what others are doing to raise the global frequency. Remember, change begins with you. You have all the power to change the world. Start today and get visible.